So I thought I'd talk a little bit today about the Buddha's very first teaching on suffering, which is the translation of dukkha. And the word suffering is not kind of the way we use it normally in English. Is really kind of a particular idea of like real distress, really suffering a lot. But what it's referring to here is a much wider idea of what you could call two kinds of distress that we experience. The inevitable suffering of just being alive, which involves getting injuries, getting sick, things going wrong at work or in your relationships, or people dying, things unexpected happening, plans not happening. These kind of like inevitable things that happen to every single living person throughout all of time. These kinds of suffering, from the littlest thing, like spilling something, to the most extreme thing, losing someone that you love, for example. These are inevitable. And the liberation that the Buddha talks about from suffering in relation to those is what we call radical acceptance of them. So that's, well, first of all, actually, is this fan, I just want to see if this fan is, I'm going to turn this fan off in case it affects the recording. In Buddhism, it's called radical acceptance, which is to be able to know that these inevitable forms of suffering happen. And when they happen, even if they are very unpleasant and they cause you, upset, which is appropriate, you can at the same time be able to go something along the lines of course, this is what happens when you're a human. This is what happens when you have a body and when you have a sense of your own existence. When you have a sense of your own existence, things are going to go wrong because you have an idea of how they should go, and they just don't always go that way. So radical acceptance is on a sort of a deep physical level. You can go, that makes sense. It's not what I want, but it makes sense. Because everything makes sense. If you could look at all the causes and conditions, everything makes sense. So that's a radical acceptance. And when you cultivate that sort of radical acceptance, which we'll talk a little bit about cultivation in a few minutes, when you've cultivated that sort of radical acceptance, then the pain or the suffering that you feel when things don't go the way you want them to go is greatly diminished. It's not gone because we have a physical body. If you break your leg, for example, there'll be pain. There's just no getting around it. It's going to hurt. But you can really shift your mental attitude to that pain. So, for example, say you broke your leg. What a lot of people would do is, before they've even arrived at the hospital, if you're fortunate enough to be able to go to one, before they've even arrived, they've already played out all the things in the future that now won't happen. And often that causes a whole lot more distress before any of those things have come to pass. So part of what our training is to be able to separate out the suffering that happens that we can't stop from happening by developing this radical acceptance, which doesn't mean you can't still take action to improve things. It just means in the first instance you can accept it. To be able to distinguish that sort of suffering from what in many ways may be the greater suffering, maybe not for everybody, but for many people, the greater suffering is the self-generated suffering in our minds, the self-generated distress that sometimes manifests in a much quieter way, just like a restless dissatisfaction somehow. Life's just not quite good enough. I'm just not quite good enough. They're just not quite good enough. My job's not quite good enough. That kind of just undercurrent of dissatisfaction. So often the translation of dukkha is restless unsatisfactoriness or restless dissatisfaction. And I think, probably most people do have that. There's not many people that if you really ask them and they were to be truly honest, like, are you completely fine with yourself and with your life? Probably not a very big percentage of people that could really genuinely say, yeah, no, yeah, it's all right, it's good, I'm happy with my life. I think most people maybe not. Could be wrong, but I think not. So this is usually what brings people to practice in the first place, either a somewhat loud unhappiness, but often it's just a kind of a little uncomfortableness that is ameliorated each day by things like having another cup of coffee, or buying more food, or watching more videos, or doing the things that people do to kind of try and manage that sort of energy. So this was what the Buddha first wanted to teach people, is to understand the inevitability of certain type of suffering and how we generate a lot of additional suffering. And we can be liberated from both of them in different ways. We're liberated from the first by a kind of radical acceptance, which means we don't add any additional suffering. There's just the pain. Sometimes in the teachings they distinguish pain from suffering, pain representing the inevitable sorts of things that happen to all people, differently to all people, but in the bigger picture pretty much the same for everybody. Just the details are different, the names of the people and the locations. But those sorts of inevitable pains. So we can be liberated through this radical acceptance of those. And then the suffering that we generate, we can be liberated by not generating it. It's kind of straightforward. But of course, to do that's not so easy. So I thought I'd read a couple of things. This is the Noble Eightfold Path, which is the Buddha's teaching on how to liberate ourselves from suffering. And this is a translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. And I'll just read a little piece out of here. This section is called Cutting Off the Causes of Suffering. To free ourselves from suffering fully and finally, we have to eliminate it by the root, and that means to eliminate ignorance. So ignorance, the way we use ignorance in Buddhism, isn't so much the conventional idea of ignorance, like you don't know something, a certain amount of knowledge, you don't know that knowledge, you're ignorant about climate change, or you're ignorant about how the body works, or whatever things you might be ignorant about. It's not so much meaning that. It's a sort of a much wider not understanding the nature of things, not understanding sort of reality. And we have many, many misconceptions in our culture about reality. Some very simple examples. Many people function with this sense of, I am this constant. I am this thing, I am me, I have a name, and I'm a constant. I was born, I'm having this life, I'm going to die. We have a sense of being a separate entity. This is a form of ignorance. It's not that there's not some truth to that in the conventional sense, obviously. Conventionally, I don't mix up my name with anybody else's. But on a much more true, fundamental level, I am in a state of constant flux. I don't know who I am, really. I couldn't possibly write down all the details of who I am. There's just not enough pieces of paper to do it. There's no amount of data on a document that could hold all the information of who I am, so I'm unknowable. I'm made up of everything other than myself. I don't make myself, everything else makes me. So on a much deeper level, I'm not a constant, I'm not a constant. So this is what we mean, what Buddhism means when it talks about ignorance. It's a misunderstanding of how reality is. So you can just keep that in mind with here. So I'll just read that again. To free ourselves from suffering fully and finally, we have to eliminate it by the root. And that means to eliminate ignorance. But how does one go about eliminating ignorance? The answer follows clearly from the nature of the adversary. Since ignorance is a state of not knowing things as they really are, what is needed is knowledge of things as they really are. Not merely conceptual knowledge, knowledge as idea, but perceptual knowledge, a knowledge which is also a seeing, kind of a felt knowing, a felt unshakable knowing. This kind of knowing is called wisdom. Wisdom helps to correct the distorting work of ignorance. It enables us to grasp things as they are in actuality, directly and immediately, free from the screen of ideas, views and assumptions our minds ordinarily set up between themselves and the real. To eliminate ignorance, we need wisdom. But how is wisdom to be acquired? So what we can do is when we notice that we are creating additional suffering for ourselves, like something goes wrong, and then we notice that we're thinking about it over and over and over, we may be having unhelpful thoughts about it, like if this is all my fault, if I hadn't done this thing it wouldn't have happened, or it's all their fault, if they hadn't done that thing it wouldn't have happened, or whatever else we might be generating over and over and over. And people do this kind of generating of harmful thinking for years, sometimes over an event, for years later. And in fact, I remember hearing a very interesting interview with someone about how much more painful it is often for a family. For example, if a family has lost a loved one in a tragic circumstance, maybe the person was in an accident and they died, the person in the accident had let's just say, a very brief experience that maybe lasted 4 minutes from the time they were hurt to the time they died, let's say. So they suffered for that number of minutes. But the family can suffer for years, for hours every day, hours every week, for years and years and years. The family suffers because they keep thinking about that 4 minutes of the person they loved. They think about it, they think about it, they think about it, they play it over, they play it over, they play it over, and they suffer and they suffer and they suffer. And that's a very good visceral way of being able to sort of see the difference actually between these two types of suffering. The person was in the accident, it was inevitable in that moment, and they suffered for 4 minutes. And then everybody else, understandably, like it's not a judgment in a kind of like you're doing the wrong thing. It's just an observation. It's just a simple observation that if we repeat painful thoughts over and over and over, we will create suffering for ourselves and for people around us, because it's not good for anybody. It doesn't help anybody for someone to maybe be guilty for years, or to be resentful for years, or to be fearful for years. It's not helpful to anyone. So the teachings aren't kind of coming down heavily on us when we do this, saying you shouldn't be doing this. They're just saying in a very pragmatic way, this isn't actually going to be good for you or anybody else. You might want to try learning how not to do it. And the way in our tradition, in the Buddhist tradition, in our Zen tradition, is the way we learn is through Zazen practice. Through sitting still, observing the mind, really getting to know it, being able to come back into the present moment by following the breath, listening to sounds, and being able to switch our mind from thoughts that are kind of inventions in the mind. Like when we have a thought about something from the past, we're creating images and not so much sounds. We think about sounds, but we do definitely create kind of images in the mind. You can see people that their eyes are not focused on something in front of them, even though their eyes seem to be looking over there. You can tell they're not looking over there. Their eyes are kind of blank because their eyes are looking inside the imagery in their mind. We all do that. You see children just doing it when they're just daydreaming. But everybody does it. But we can learn to do it a lot less. So through the Zazen practice, and then this reference to ignorance being the source of suffering, the way we learn to understand what is ignorant and what is wise is by contemplating these teachings. Teachings on no self that I sort of mentioned earlier, on impermanence, that everything is in a state of constant change. Things are sort of constellating and becoming kind of organised, and then things are getting disorganised. And there's this constant process. If you think about a plant, there's a kind of organisation process happening where the seed mixes with the elements and turns into something that we can identify and give it a name. So it's kind of organising, and then it reaches a certain peak, and then it falls apart, and you could say it gets disorganised. And it's just this constant movement of things, organising and disorganising. That's just one way of saying it. So deep contemplation of these core teachings. Another core teaching, the Buddha nature teaching, is that everything is essentially pure and good, and it's only the addition of ignorant ideas. If we're thinking about people, it's only the addition of ignorant ideas that cause them to act in ways that cause harm, but they weren't born that way. This is a very important teaching, and it takes a long time to really integrate it, to believe it in a certain sort of sense. Some ways with the teachings we have to have a little initial willingness to think maybe this is true, like a provisional willing to believe, and then we examine it until we go like, oh, I really do think this is true. I think this is true. And there's no kind of leap of faith anymore. It's like, oh no, in my bones I feel this to be true. My experience reinforces that this is true. I've never met an evil baby. Never met one. They're only in movies. And they're the kinds of movies that I really don't like. Like I would never watch one of those sorts of movies because I think, oh no, this is about as like antithetical to truth as you can get. Why do people invent such movies? And I think it might be because on a subtle level people do think that they are an evil baby, and it somehow calms them. I want to read a little bit from Suzuki Roshi. He often speaks in a way that is kind of poetic and indirect. And so I just want to read, and it's very much the flavour of our tradition, the way he speaks. So in this couple of paragraphs, he's going to use the word balance. And it's a subtle way of when things lose their balance. It's kind of a subtle way of maybe talking about suffering or things being unexpected or things being challenging. So he uses the word loss of balance. To live in the realm of Buddha nature means to die as a small being moment after moment. When we lose our balance, we die. But at the same time, we also develop ourselves and we grow. Whatever we see is changing. It's losing its balance. The reason everything looks beautiful is because it is out of balance, and its background is always in perfect harmony. This is how everything exists in the realm of Buddha nature, losing its balance against a background of perfect balance. So if you see things without realizing the background of Buddha nature, everything appears to be in the form of suffering. But if you understand the background of existence, you realize that suffering itself is how we live and how we extend our life. So in Zen, sometimes we emphasize the imbalance or disorder of life. I was talking to someone yesterday about this idea of in the foreground is the imbalance, is things that are happening, and it's those things that are happening that cause us upset, and we have to put in effort to manage them and rearrange them and do things with them. But if we can at the same time have a background that is stable, then we can manage all the things in the foreground. And this background, here Suzuki Roshi calls that Buddha nature. There's lots of metaphors for this background. Sometimes the image of a screen, if you think of it like in a picture theatre, in the cinema, big screen, no matter what film is projected onto that screen, the screen doesn't crack, the screen doesn't break, the screen doesn't get stained. The screen is there and the images are on the screen. And if all we think about is the images on the screen, then you can see how our lives would just be like up, down, up, down, up, down the whole time. Like, oh, that's good. Oh, no, that's bad. Oh, no, it's good again. Oh, no, it's bad again. What a chaos that would be. But if at the same time as being involved in the movie, let's say, at the same time as being involved in it and wanting to be a beneficial force in it, I mean, this is part of Buddhism as a religion, is that we are dedicated to wanting to be of benefit in the world. If at the same time as we're engaging with all of the things in the foreground, wanting to be of benefit with all of those things in the foreground, but if at the same time we're aware of the screen, we're aware of something stable and constant that isn't affected by all the things, then we have a lot more energy. Then we don't burn out. Then we don't become cynical. Then we don't get depressed. And what is that screen? Well, Suzuki Roshi calls it Buddha nature. Sometimes people call it the indestructible now. I often think of it that way. Just this now, the present, the space I'm in, it's like space itself cannot be destroyed. You can put things in space, you can take things out of the space, you can blow things up in that space, you can throw paint at the space, but the space itself is just there, just keeps always being there. So if we have this sense that there is something stable, I like to think of it as just this awareness that I have in the now. I can always just be aware now, here, now. That doesn't get taken away from me. I'm aware. No matter what's happening, I can bring that awareness. That's kind of like the screen, and the stuff happens. So each of us needs to find for ourselves what is that truly stable, truly reliable. It's not the foreground. People try to find stability in the foreground with their mortgage or their retirement plan or whatever people have. They try to find, or their family. You try to find stability there, and it's not there. The difficulty with that is it can almost be stable. So people get tricked into thinking it is, but it's not. Same with our body. Even if you've got a fit and healthy body, you can have the illusion that it's stable, but actually it's not. It's relatively stable. Things are relatively stable, or everything would be chaotic, but they're not actually 100% stable. But there is, however you want to find for yourself, what is the stability that it can allow you to move, and in the end, from the Buddha's way of speaking of this first teaching, be liberated from suffering. I think that's enough. Would anybody like to ask a question or comment in the Zendo or online? Hold on just a second, Nick. I'm going to plug this in so we can... Actually, I think they can hear you quite well.
Thank you, Neti. It's always such a pleasure to be here, and such interesting topics, in particular the suffering and the Buddha nature. And I just feel in the last few years, personally, of coming here and having this in my life, understand the suffering. It has made me more aware of myself and my mortality, and in that compassion and understanding for others as well. And the Buddha nature, I think, I won't cry, but I was so angry for years, so angry, and brain fog and just unhappy. And simply sitting in yourself, and again, you do those external things of looking after your vessel or stimulants or different things to make you feel better, but it's not until you literally sit with yourself and learn who you are, and just this simple breath, just how transformative it is. So I always thank you. Thank you.
Lauren.
Thanks, Neti, for that talk. I really enjoyed it as well. I wonder if you could say a bit more about the radical part of radical acceptance. So what's that meant to indicate versus just the notion of acceptance?
Maybe it's not different, but it might be just that most people's idea of acceptance maybe doesn't quite go so fully and completely, because we can actually develop this acceptance right at the front, like right close to the moment. I've shared this before, but when I lost my house in the Black Summer fires, I was surprised that the first thought that came into my head was, well, why not my house? I was kind of surprised that that happened. So right there, right from the very start, there was a sense of course, my house is in the forest. There's been a long drought. There's no particular reason why it shouldn't be my house. So that it's kind of, I guess, radical acceptance is cultivating the capacity to accept anything and everything, which, as I mentioned, doesn't mean passivity. Sometimes people quite commonly confuse acceptance with being passive. It's not passive. After that happened, a whole lot of activity went into play. My son, met with different government departments to organise funding. There was a whole lot of things that were done for people who lost their houses, which I'm eternally grateful for, to the Victorian government for the things they did to help people. All of that then went into action. There was a lot of motion that then happened. And there was also such a sense of when that happened too, and maybe this is part of radical acceptance, is seeing that in that particular moment when something bad happens to us, almost instantly realising this kind of bad thing happens to lots of people. So rather than like, I'm having this thing happen to me, it's like, oh, I'm having this thing happen that happens to everybody. Well, not everybody the same, but lots of people lose their houses in different sorts of fires and in floods and in all sorts of reasons people lose their houses. And of course, you can put in houses or any other thing that people lose. So radical acceptance is not feeling isolated in the pain, but actually in that actually feeling a greater sense of connectedness with other people and a greater sense of empathy with other people. And plants and animals, lots of plants and animals lost their homes too, you know, and so being able to really expand that sense. So it's kind of a profound kind of acceptance. So maybe we use the word radical acceptance because it's an all-embracing, all-encompassing acceptance. But it also doesn't mean that there might not be tears. You know, it doesn't mean you can't be sad. Because we are people and it makes sense to be a little bit sad about things, or maybe very sad. But still you can be sad with acceptance at the same time. It's quite possible to hold the two together. You can be accepting of the tears as well, accepting of the or the shock. You know, sometimes something happens and it's a real shock and you can feel like, I think I am kind of in a state of shock. And you can have acceptance about the fact that you're in a sort of state of shock. Because humans, our psyches only evolved to cope with a certain amount of shock. And when it goes over a certain threshold, we go into a state, you know, which for some, when it gets to strong enough, then we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's also a place to go, oh, I'm having PTSD the same way as millions of people over the centuries have had it. They might call it something else. Not everybody calls it that. That term's only been around for, I don't know how many decades now, but it's not been around that long. But that experience is a common experience, and it can deepen our sense of connectedness rather than making us feel more isolated. Commonly when people suffer, they feel more isolated. Yeah. Bill.
Yeah, thanks, Neti. Very, very good talk. I wanted to expound a little bit on one of the examples you gave of suffering in the way that, say, if something's bad has happened to one of your loved ones, how afterwards you can suffer for a really long time. I feel like it's not just, you know, replaying the 4 minutes or whatever where that person might have suffered, but you know, that second arrow, as I've heard you call it before, can be so much other bits in it, right? Of like, oh, I shouldn't have let them go, or I should have been with them, for example. A whole bunch of regret can come up. You might think I wasn't square with that person when it happened or whatever, so I'll never get that back, for example. Like, there's so much that different ways, and the further out you get from it, you know, you can have it manifest in all different ways that it can come up, and it can seem unrecognisable, and it might seem like a wholesome thought at first as well. I recently found this cool resource online where you can listen to some of the Pali Canon, just the sutras being read by someone. So it's something I'll just, when I go for a walk, I'll just chuck on one of those. And one of them that came up was really interesting, and it kind of has the flavour that you talked about, where it's a teaching that I'm not sure if I like it yet, but I'm gonna give it a go, try it on. The Buddha says there's like different stages of, or different ways of dealing with these delusions. So he says that at the lowest level, sometimes you'll have a delusive thought, you'll recognise it as a delusive thought, and you'll just decide you don't want to have that anymore. Then he says, it can be a bit harder. You recognise a delusive thought, but it keeps coming up, and you have to sort of consciously put it down every time it comes up. And then he says there's another one where you try to put it down, but you just keep having it. And he says, I can't remember if there was like 3 or 4 stages, but eventually he says maybe what you have to do, if it's really bad, is kind of retreat from it in some ways. Like, I don't know if I understood this right, and maybe you could answer this, but he says in some cases you've got to sort of adapt your life to stop the causes and conditions that surface that delusion in some ways. Like, because for some people, yeah, the experience of that can be so hard, maybe. Yeah.
I'll have to get that podcast from you, whatever it is.
Yeah. I think it's called Access to Insight, and it's just this website
Access to Insight.
put up by the Insight Meditation people, where they've just got someone reading the sutra.
Yeah, so you sort of went through different ways that we have noticed we have repetitive thoughts that are delusional or ignorant and that cause us to suffer. Yeah, and that last one, maybe you have to distance itself. That, I think of people who, for whatever reason, and we don't even have to know the reason, for some reason, they have a very addictive way of being in the world, and the only way they've discovered in the end is they have to be separate from it. So they have to not go to parties where there's going to be alcohol and not have friends who drink alcohol, or whatever the substance might be. Or it might not even be a substance, it might be, people, one of the ways people breaking their addiction to screens is they have to not have a smartphone. And sometimes that's just the way it is. And I think we can have a bit of humility about that I can't actively undo this pattern. Maybe, from a psychological perspective, it may be either chemical, or it could be just from so early in our childhood that the impulse is just there. And no matter how much therapy we do, the best way is to not be in contact with whatever it might be. Yeah, so part of wisdom is cultivating the appropriate way, working out what we can do, and how what we're capable of. And with practice over time, our capacity does. My experience of myself and as others is our capacity for managing and not having as many delusional thoughts really does grow. And we have this beautiful experience that people have shared here where they surprise themselves, just like I was surprised that I didn't get upset when my house burnt down. I made a mistake with building the other day, and I was surprised that I didn't get upset. It's like, wow. And then I undid the thing I'd done and then did it a different way, and that turned out to not be the right way either. So I'd end up spending hours working in the hot sun, and I didn't get upset. It's like, I worked out my original way was the right way, I just hadn't done it quite right. So I had to redo it all again, the way I originally had done it. And still I didn't get upset. It's like, wow, this practice is miraculous. Because 15 years ago or 20 years ago, I would have cried. I would have stood there going, oh my God, this is like a symbol of how my whole life is going to fall apart. I would have gone into some catastrophic thinking. This is the beginning of the end because I am an idiot. No, it just would have gone on and on and on. But none of that happened at all. So all of us, as we practice, what is so beautiful is if we just do the meditation, contemplate the teachings, and do things together. Together is a very important part of it. The work is happening, the change is happening, the delusions are falling away. That's just actually happening. We don't notice it happening, it's just happening. And then we have a little pointed moment and we get to see, oh my gosh, it's not so much that I've become better, it's just I've shed a delusion. I'm shedding ignorance, I'm shedding mistaken views. And we didn't notice it happening, but we get these moments where we get to see it. It is happening. And that's encouraging. It helps us to keep practicing. Jisen.
Thank you, Mushin. That was a really interesting talk. And I'm just thinking about what everybody's saying, and what's striking me is that there's an acceptance, radical acceptance. There's an acceptance of a situation, but even though I can accept a situation, there might be still a little bit of me that's holding on, and I haven't accepted myself, something about myself that I haven't accepted. And in that, it's not quite radical. I haven't, as you say, I haven't shared, or I haven't been able to take a big step back into Buddha mind or big mind or whatever, because radical acceptance is like accepting the situation and all the little flaws about myself that is responding to that situation, like I'm accepting the whole thing. And that's kind of what I'm hearing in this conversation amongst all of us, the group wisdom. But it's a lovely talk. Thank you.
Yeah, and just one last thing on that. Part of what happens with doing Zazen is we get to notice something like what you're just saying, Mushin. You notice part of you maybe holds on to something. Just the fact that we can notice that in ourselves is part of the solution, so to speak, is part of the cultivation of wisdom, is to notice ourselves and what our patterns are and get to know them, you know. That often happens. We have a little sort of like, gosh, I just kind of realised that I'm super nervous about this thing. Then we go, I wonder why I'm nervous. Then we might have this thought about, well, those people sort of seem to symbolise people who are better than me, or you know, whatever it might be. We get to slow down enough to notice these thoughts that are just sort of there, sitting maybe not right in the foreground, but a little bit further back. But the quietness of our Zazen practice allows us to have enough space that things can come into the foreground for us to look at. So there's so much that comes from just sitting still. Creates space, lots of space. Right, well, thank you. We'll finish off with another short chant and then do 3 prostrations. So, Nick, you just do a clack across the top. Beings are numberless. I vow to save them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable. I vow to become it.